It's long past time. We got back out there. So where to? Dulles International Airport. Let your imagination soar. Book now at flydulles.com/nonstop.
This is Ralph Rentler, director of the Smithsonian Bicentennial Folklife Festival. If you enjoyed the festival, you'll be interested in this invitation.
Ladies and gentlemen, an opportunity like this cannot be taken for granted.
This evening, we are going to be beating our hearts out for you all, so I want to see people enjoying themselves. So get up and feel the music and do something about it, okay?
This event is a right of cultural democracy.
We have many, many partners, you included. I encourage you to stand alongside with us as we travel this journey year after year.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this hot but fine day here at the 2023 Smithsonian Folklife Festival. My name is Rebecca Fenton. I'm part of the curatorial team for one of our programs, Creative Encounters, Living Religions in the U.S. I'm going to make some announcements and thank some of our sponsors, and then I'll introduce the panelists with whom I'm honored to share the stage this afternoon. For over 50 years, the Smithsonian Folklife Festival has convened people here on the National Mall to explore, to exchange, and engage with the power of culture and creativity in our lives today. We would love for you to share your festival stories on social media using our hashtag 2023FolkLife. The Smithsonian Folklife Festival is produced by the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage and is presented in partnership with the National Park Service. This festival is made possible by people like you. You can visit festival.si.edu to join our community of contributors. We also receive federally appropriated funds, Smithsonian Trust funds, contributions from governments, businesses, foundations, and individuals, in-kind assistance, and food recording and craft sales. Here at the festival, we strive to maintain an accessible and inclusive environment for visitors of all abilities. And if you are in need of accessible seating options or assistive listening during this presentation, please see the venue manager volunteer in the back or on the sides of this venue for assistance. You can also find detailed information about all of our accessibility services, including ASL interpretation, audio description, real-time captioning, and a variety of other services on the festival website, which I mentioned, or by visiting the information booth, which is a little green box right over there. We had promotional support provided by the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority and Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. The Creative Encounters program has also been generously supported by the Lilly Endowment's Religion and Cultural Institutions Initiative, which is a national program supporting museums and cultural organizations like ours to increase the public understanding of religion and religious diversity, and to present the contributions of people of all faiths to our country. The program also received federal support from the Latino Initiatives Pool, administered by the National Museum of the American Latino, and the Asia Pacific American Initiatives Pool, administered by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific America Center. Additionally, we have a number of community partners who contributed to the Creative Encounters program in many ways. And for this particular session, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the United States. All right, with all of that said, welcome. Again, my name is Rebecca. I'm honored to be sharing the stage today for a panel with Yolanda Pierce. She is Dean of the Divinity School at Vanderbilt University. So she'll be leaving us here in DC soon. Congratulations, Yolanda. We have Casey Slack, who is senior leader at the Washington Ethical Society. We have Dia Tahir Barker. She is the Sadr, or the president, of the Women's Auxiliary of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. And last but not least, Reverend Beth Lockhart. She is a pastor at Christ the King Deaf Church. So the reason we are gathered here today is to explore how women and non-binary people lead in spiritual life in so many different ways, even though across many religious and spiritual and other community institutions, there are differing views on the roles of women and non-binary people in leadership. So in this session, we're going to highlight vibrant traditions of women and non-binary participation in spiritual communities, and also hear from these speakers about the challenges and opportunities that they're finding in their work in religious, spiritual, and community leadership. So in this session, I'm interested in hearing about your journeys into leadership to some extent, as well as, perhaps more importantly, hearing about some of your accomplishments and the ways you're working with others to build more inclusive spiritual communities and to achieve common goals. So to start, I'd like to hand it first to Yolanda, but I'd like each of you in turn, if you would, tell us a little bit about your journey into leadership and the positions you hold now. Did you have role models when you were growing up, or when you were considering embarking on the path that you have taken? Yolanda, would you start us off?
Sure, I'm happy to start us off. That's a great question. It's a two-part question. One is about the journey, and one is about the role model. I will say about the role models, the answer is really embodied in the Lucille Clifton poem, where she talks about how she had to build a bridge because there was no role model, and so she couldn't be anything but herself. And so when I entered into the position as dean at Howard Divinity, I was the first woman to do so in the school's 150-year history. So there was no precedent for that. But I will say, as a woman growing up in a community of faith, I had lots of role models. And I will take, I think, this moment then to say something, that the role models that I had weren't necessarily about women in leadership, if we define leadership as the person who has the mic, or if we define leadership as the person whose name is on the marquee, on the door. But I had role models of incredibly strong, powerful women who led by serving. And so I understand myself to be a leader only in as much as I'm here to serve.
Thank you. Casey, would you like to answer next?
Yeah. You know, I didn't come up in a faith tradition at all. My parents are non-religious, and so my choice to go into ministry was a pretty big shock to all of us. But so I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and I work in ethical culture spaces. So I work in spaces where women have been ordained for a really long time. But I'm not a woman. I'm a non-binary person, and that's newer for everybody. Right? We've had non-binary people for a long time, but not in name and not in big positions and roles. So when I received preliminary fellowship, which is like the first thing in a line of UU goals, I was one of 2 trans people in that whole ceremony. And there had been very few of us up until that point. We're at a point in my faith traditions where we have a good amount of leadership, but I'm part of a first generation of leaders, of people who have been making up what it means to be trans in not just a public-facing leadership role, but a religious or faith-based public-facing leadership role. And I wound up at the Washington Ethical Society with the great gift of having had a fellow non-binary person right before me as the interim minister, as the interim leader. And that really gave space so I don't have to do all of the use my pronouns correctly work. And I can work on, okay, so what's it like for us to all see each other fully instead of having to do the 101 conversation every time.
Great, thank you. Dia, will you tell us about your experience and your journey to be in charge of a very large and important national organization today?
Yes, thank you for inviting me here. As I was listening, first thing that popped in my mind was, how much time do we have?
Oh.
Secondly, well, I think my journey started with observation and looking at interactions within the society, and my heart and compassion was for justice. So when I came upon the religion of Islam, I followed it for several years and learned the teachings and found that it's a universal religion, even though a lot of people in society think it's just specifically for one group of people, but the teachings are universal. And it's for the establishment of justice across the lifetime for all people, past, present, and future. So that attracted me initially and started me on my journey. As I read more about the religion, particularly Ahmadiyya, and I just want to say a little bit about our community. It was founded in 1889 by a person named Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, who lived way over in Qadian, India, a little small area. And that person was championing the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, who brought about Islam. In the United States, it appeared after one of the missionaries came here in the 1920s and then began to teach, Americans about the religion. And that's kind of like how my journey is starting with that missionary work. And in 1922, the Women's Auxiliary was established worldwide, and in 1935, it was established here in the United States. So as an individual, again, gravitating to justice for all, I just began to work and serve. And as I worked and served, I like to be in the background, so this setting right here is not really my norm.
You're stretching today.
Yes.
Thank you.
But, people recognize individuals who are championing social justice and women's rights and, serving humanity. And without my own doing, I think God just kind of moved me forward, and individuals recognize that. And in our religious organizational structure, we have a election process. So the women in our auxiliary, I assume, recognized my capabilities and my sincerity, and then in 2018 elected me as their national president in the United States. In regards to a leader, again, a good leader is amongst the people. And all religious prophets came from working within the community and serving the community. And again, I hope that I portray that to my community and the community at large. And I pull from people I admire, my teachers, other individuals who are serving the world at large, and I try to emulate those characteristics. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Beth, I turn to you. I know from speaking to you before that you had quite a long process towards entering ministry in a formal way. Would you share a little bit about why you decided to pursue ministry and kind of how your path took shape?
Well, first of all, just thank you for welcoming me. So I don't need a microphone, so I don't need to worry about that. So I grew up in the church. So I grew up in a very conservative Lutheran church. My father was the church administrator. My uncles were pastors. My grandfathers, my ancestors were all involved in the church. We were very comfortable. I became deaf at age 6, and I had a big life change. So I learned sign language later in life. And, while I was in college, I was at a private Lutheran university, and I was doing a self-reflection, and I was writing, and I was answering these questions, and I realized that I had a skilled gift to be a pastor and a professor. And I asked, one of my professors, I said, look, this is what it's telling me. And then this man said to me, look, women don't receive that type of spiritual gift as a pastorship. And I wondered, how could the test be half right and half wrong all the time? So, while I was in college, I was, one really strong female interpreter really just influenced me during that time. And, I became involved in female spirituality. It became exciting for me, and I started to think about the idea of becoming a pastor. But at the same time, I was, focusing on becoming a teacher, and there's only one Lutheran church in Minneapolis that would be liberal enough and would have an open mind to have a female pastor. So I realized that it just wasn't worth it in that time for me. Later on, 15 years later, I finished college. I went to graduate school. I started working, and there was a deaf church in Philadelphia. I was teaching there. I was doing everything except actually preaching and actually giving the sacrament. And I felt inside, I felt a real calling from God, and I felt like I had to really take this spiritual assessment again. I had the same answers again. Said that I'd be great as a pastor. I took it again. I got the same results again. And then finally, I just gave up and I said, okay, God, you win. And at that time, I transferred to a more liberal Lutheran group. It was the Evangelist Lutheran, it was the ELCA, and they recognized women as pastors and as leaders in church. And from there, things went forward. I became a pastor for the deaf. And I was actually the first deaf Lutheran pastor in the world who was a woman. Now there's a second one in Nigeria, and a third who has recently been ordained in Florida. So it's very exciting that there's 3 of us now in the world. So, yeah. We have a deaf congregation in Westchester and Philadelphia, actually, in Pennsylvania, and also work for the ELCA as a deaf a deaf ministry director here in the United States. So we have a service ministry program, and we focus on that as well.
Great, thank you. Almost everyone who's spoken so far has mentioned service as an important characteristic of their work and of the idea of leadership, as Yolanda evoked in her first comment, that there's many ways of showing leadership and many ways of serving others. I'd like to keep the spotlight on Beth, if I could, and would you share with us a little bit about the service work that you lead in association with your congregation?
Yeah, so about 13 years ago, our church recognized that the deaf community at large didn't really have a place for getting services or help. They couldn't go to mainstream providers because they didn't understand deaf culture, and our language, American Sign Language, was a barrier. Oftentimes they would misdiagnose people, they would hurt people rather than help people because of the misunderstandings. People would come to the church saying, oh, look, I need help with domestic violence, or my father kicked me out of the house because I'm gay, or, I've just arrived here in the country, I don't know what to do next. So, we decided to set up a organization called the Deaf Community Action Network, and it's called DeafCan, that's the acronym. And really a lot of hearing people say the deaf can't do things, they can't do anything, they can't learn, they can't do this and that, and they can't develop faith, they can't drive, and that's been a common paradigm. So our organization is called DeafCan, and I'm the executive director of that organization, and it's grown quite a bit, and we're contracted now with 2 counties, and we're providing services, and we've been expanding quite a bit, and now we're providing a diversity of services to deaf individuals in 5 counties, plus we serve deaf-blind individuals in 7 counties. So, we do need SSPS, service providers, to help really guide deafblind individuals through shopping, through opening mail. So that's what an SSPS would help with. And there are deaf people who are in prison or who are leaving prison, and they often are the most neglected populations in the country. And deaf people don't have access to telephones inside prisons, and oftentimes they end up not having they don't have basically access to rehab classes and stuff, so they end up in maximum security prisons, and they end up being stuck there for the maximum amount of time because they don't have access to these other rehab programs. So oftentimes they end up in a halfway house, and those halfway houses are hearing halfway houses. There's no one there that understands American Sign Language or deaf culture, and if they break a rule, they don't even know about the rule. They end up being back in prison for a rule that they were never told about. So that's been a huge frustration. There's a large group of deaf immigrants as well, and I think some of them are here. Raise your hand if you're here, actually. There's some here, actually. So, people coming from different countries, and, we have right now people from Colombia, the Philippines, Iraq, Libya. So, we have a lot of different international deaf people here now. People come to this country, and they leave traumatic experiences in their home countries, and when they come here, they face, oftentimes their families can't communicate with them because of their language barriers, and our service really helps teach English and American Sign Language to family members and provide services that help them get jobs and help them get the supports that they needed, help their families find housing, learn to drive, and most importantly, pass their citizenship exam and take their oath. So, so that they could say, we can actually say that 95% of our people have passed, so we're happy and very proud of them.
Thanks, Beth. Congratulations. Some of your remarks made me think about, you spoke about how the work of Deaf Can reaches deaf people, but also cuts across people of many different backgrounds, needs, intersecting different identities. I wondered if, Casey, you would next like to speak about your perspective about building an inclusive faith or spiritual community, whether you want to speak about your current role or previous leadership roles. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. One of the things that I most want to say is that ethical culture is really a religion of relationship. And I think that is one of those places where I am fed in the work of building inclusive, really inclusive communities. When you get to know people as they are, when you let people tell you who they are, then you get to open yourself up and meet someone for real. And that is it's a really, I'm going to say magical, though many of my people would not use that word. It's a really magical and life-giving experience when you get to meet someone as their whole self. And I remember my formative experiences in religion were of going to mostly Christian churches and being told that the questions that I had weren't okay, that because I had the body I had, I couldn't be a leader, and then because I was queer, I really couldn't be a leader. I couldn't even be around in a lot of those situations. And the first time I went to a Unitarian Universalist congregation, somebody came up to me and asked me who I was, not with any guesses about who I was based on what I looked like that day, not with any judgment for who I might be. And at that particular moment, I was a really unemployed 22-year-old with very little idea what was going on in my life, much less the rest of the world. And to have an adult, a leader in that congregation, come to me and say, "Who are you? What are your gifts?" and find gifts in me that I didn't even realize that I had, was a revelatory experience for me. So as a leader and in community, what I'm trying to do is see people as their whole embodied selves, whatever that means for them. To hear in people's stories echoes of my own story, echoes of other stories I've heard, and make myself and our community larger. And I'm going to say larger in spirit, though that is not always how we would make those words. Larger in spirit than it had before. It's really easy to look at people and see a category in front of you. You were talking about how people see deaf people and assume all of these things about what you can and cannot do that are simply not true. For me, people look at me and they see a fat person or they see a queer transgender person and they have assumptions about what that means about my capacity, what that means about my preferences, what that means about my life. And they're not always true, and they're limiting. So these boxes that we get put in, though oppression is a very real thing and affects us all in intersecting ways, the box isn't the whole story of a person. So my perspective and my approach to making really inclusive community is really based on relationship, is really based on showing up and saying, hey, this is who I am, who are you? Let's know each other and be embiggened by our mutual knowing.
Thank you for sharing that vision. Yes. I think that many times, a perception of the place or the role of women and queer people in religious communities can seem to be defined by prohibitions or rules that say, do not, do not, do not. But I think that's only part of the picture. And Dia, I would like for you to tell us about, if anyone started to read about your organization and your community, they would see that you do a lot. Would you tell us a little bit about some of the activities of the Women's Auxiliary or, within your smaller community, if you'd like to share about some of the service and actions that you all do?
Yes, thank you. So it just so happens that this is the year that we're celebrating 100 years of our Ahmadi Muslim Women Auxiliary. So we're very blessed and honored to be here so that we can showcase some of the work that we've been doing. Also, I'd just like to say that we have some community members out in the audience. That, as you mentioned, we're very supportive of the folk festival here at the Smithsonian. So that's one example of, work that we do. As a organized religious auxiliary consisting of women and young girls, there's two main things in our religion of Islam, and that is what's called Kukla Abad and Kukla Allah, which means that we establish a relationship with God, and then we establish a relationship with mankind through service. So with that, we have initiated a lot of community service internally in our community and externally. Internally, we have our National Social Service Secretary, who happens to be in the audience there, Sister Cassandra. And one prime example was during the COVID pandemic. We rallied all our members across the United States, and there's approximately 9,000 of us. And we began to make these masks that everyone was wearing to prevent the transmission of COVID. And we made over 50,000 handmade masks that we distributed across the country to individuals that were in need, including the medical profession. We also serve humanity by having food distributions. We work with one of our sister organizations called Humanity First, a 401c program, and that we go to areas within the United States that are in need and also across the waters, abroad. We have a program called Walk the Arzi, which means that we dedicate our skills and our knowledge and our time to serve mankind. So we have people who are volunteering at Pakistan Tahir Heart Institute. We have members who are in Guatemala working in the hospital there. We have our membership that has raised money and are supporting villages in Africa, build solar panels and water wells and roads for countries that, the rural cities that are in those countries. We also have work that we're doing here in the United States in the Title I schools, where we're tutoring and also presenting a true picture of Islam. And I can go on and on and on,
I'm sure.
but one last point that I like to share is that because people have sometimes misunderstandings, and as you mentioned, not inclusive, and I love the folk song that was ending that previous section, that we're under a tent and all are welcome. That's what we want to portray in our religious community, that Islam unifies all the religion, that there's one God that we all, praise and we try to emulate. And because of that, we are, connecting with people and creating interfaith programs and partnerships so that we can dispel and also make people feel comfortable coming up to you and asking questions if you're outside of their comfort zone.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Everything that you've shared about is so multidimensional, the projects and the roles that you have. So bringing it back to you, Yolanda, you're an educator, a public intellectual and author. Would you share with us about kind of the achievements or how you see your work working in educational spaces or within, your own faith community to which you belong now?
So I just want to echo the amazing comments that have come from the other panelists. I really think that the work that most recently has been most important to me has been interfaith work. The ways in which communities of various faith come together and reason together, because I think that is our challenge. Our challenge is the richness of our diversity of faiths living together in peace and in harmony, having space for us to be who we are, and not any less than who we are, but for others to be who they are. And so this interfaith work, for 5 years, I served as the chair of the Interfaith Council in DC, and then I continue with a group of people who represent the Abrahamic religions as we are reading through texts together. And one of the things we discover as we're reading through our sacred scripture with one another, as we're thinking about, for me as a theologian, those big theological questions, is that everyone has the same set of questions. We want to be loved. We want to be appreciated. We want to know, where is God when things are bad? Where is God when I'm suffering? We have the same sets of questions that we bring to bear in our faith traditions. And so our ability and capacity to talk with each other and not across one another, to be firm and solid in our own identities, but to have room in that big tent for other people and other voices, I think that has to be the future of religious faith. And I say this as someone who works in higher education and as someone who is a theologian, that the only way that we can have the richness of this religiously diverse democracy, deliberately founded as such, not founded as a Christian nation, but deliberately founded as a diverse religious democracy, is our ability to speak across all of our different organizations and faiths and denominations, to have the difficult conversations, but to walk away knowing that we've been enriched by one another.
Thank you, Yolanda. I think that speaking as part of the organizing team, one of the things that we hope to achieve by staging this program is, much like what you were saying, I think that we, here in the United States, we can live side by side with people from other faith communities or traditions and somehow never quite get to know what that is for them. Well, what do they eat on their holiday meals? Or what do they do in their house of worship when they meet? Why do they go on that day and not this other day? So I'm hoping that through conversations like this, we're going to become better equipped to have more fruitful conversations in the future. And in that spirit, I wanted to ask any of you, do you have a question you'd like to ask one of your co-panelists, or another follow-up that you'd like to make to some of the questions that have been answered here today?
I would love it when you mention the challenges that deaf people face in prison. That never occurred to me. When you said something that really opened up for me So our brothers and sisters, our family members who are incarcerated face so many challenges. But then you add to that being deaf, and I'm just wondering, I would love to hear more about that kind of work. I would love to hear more about, are there chaplains who are training in sign language? Are there legal aid clinics? What is it that people of faith can do to really help support the most vulnerable of even the most vulnerable who are in an incarcerated setting and can't necessarily get access because they cannot hear? I would love to hear more about that.
So there are some pastors who do go into prisons and do work with the deaf. My husband actually does go. He's not a pastor, but he sometimes goes and interprets the all-faith worship sessions for them. But you know, those in terms of providing spiritual support for who they are, what they're struggling with, and not trying to convert anybody, but really just trying to go and encourage them and give them hope and let them know that people outside of prison are thinking about them and praying for them. So that's the work that he's been doing, and it's part of it. It's providing some educational classes in sign language so that they can actually have access to learn instead of coming out into the community and not having that education. And really, it's really relational mentoring is what it is.
And I like just to leave a message that, you know, there is so much misunderstanding in the world. And again, as I think this panel is trying to educate individuals on our individual religious aspects, but for Islam and the Muslim woman, you know, there's this impression that we're subjugated, that we don't have respect from the men in our community or respect from the society. And we work very hard to try to dispel those misconceptions. And I think I kind of gave you a little example of some of the work that we do. But, you know, traditionally, all of us can say that our primary roles are being good wives and mothers and daughters. And all that leads to creating a good society, a heavenly society. And that, you know, we are trying our best to be good citizens in our countries and also ambassadors to wherever else that, you know, we may be. But in regards to Islam and the women's dress, you know, we're basically following our religious teachings and demonstrating that we have faith and courage to follow our teachings, and that even though society may think that it's so antiquated to be covered like we are now and not relevant to this society, well, you know, it is. There's this verse in the Holy Quran that talks to the prophet, and it says, "O prophet, tell thy wives and thy daughters and the believing women." And the believing women are not just in Islam, but in other religions and just in general, that you should pull down your outer covering. And this was to be distinguished in society. And also the verse even says, and not molested. And this was way back before we're dealing with, you know, these issues of women exploitation and molestation and the Me Too movement. So we had guidance back then, and those of us who are practicing our religion, we're doing so to not only protect ourselves, but protect the moral fiber of this society. And you know, we know it may look odd to some people, but the value and benefit is just for the society at whole. The other thing is just so, you know, the audience can take messages home. Besides, you know, what we're doing now currently in this century, way back when in the days of the prophet, even before, you know, we're seeing the ideology of Islam. You know, there were women who fought in battles. There were women who sold and made donations, and one particular person was called respected Zainab, who was so well in her stitching and that she donated to other people that she received the name as Mother of the Charitable. You know, and then there was another respected lady who was the wife of our Prophet Muhammad. Her name was respected Aisha. May God be pleased with her. And she was well educated. And the men recognized her education, and she taught men. And she was so well versed in the Islamic jurisprudence, genealogy. That was way back when. You know, now, you know, everyone's more familiar with genealogy, Arabic, and medicine. So it's not anything new for our particular religion, but most people don't know the history, particularly the history as it pertains to the women in Islam.
Thanks, Dia. You're just knocking down stereotypes as you go. I think for anyone who stands out in some way, who looks different, who acts different, like, you're going to face challenges in the society that we have now, not the one that we're building that'll be better, right? But I think all of you have spoken about at times feeling like you're part of a very small group of people who are walking the path that you're on. I wonder if Casey or Yolanda, you have a few more thoughts about, you know, being trailblazers. More are coming behind you, right?
Yeah, more are coming behind us, and I have the real blessing, the real gift to get to teach classes to chaplaincy students once a year, clinical pastoral education residents in hospitals, mostly in Los Angeles, which is an interesting habit of moving a lot. But I get to teach them about LGBT inclusion in chaplaincy, and every time I teach a class, I see people not just from the traditions I come out of, but from a wide range of traditions who are defying the stereotypes of religious people by following the tenets that I think I've heard all of us say we actually hold closest, which is seeing people, which is being with people, which is caring for people when they are their most vulnerable. In the hospital, in prison, on the days that are the hardest, on those nights when you wake up at 3 in the morning and everything is the absolute worst it has ever been. And I think that our decision to be together is so much more important than all of the little stuff that pulls us apart. And I wanted to add to our conversation about interfaith work, a concept that comes to me from a great mentor and teacher of mine, Ibrahim Farajajeh, who was at one point dean of Howard Divinity School and also was a Sufi sheikh, and who was the provost at Starr King School for the Ministry, where I attended when I was there. And it's this idea of organic multi-religiosity. It's really easy to look at religions and be chunk, 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 right? Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, right? We're all separate. Well, we're all more human than we are anything else, and we're all here on this planet by however we all got here. So we owe it to ourselves to see our common humanity and to live into a future where we all get to bring the best of ourselves, where we all get to lift up our most human, squishy, nice stuff, and also the stuff that is hard and the stuff that we struggle with, and be together in all of that, in whatever ways make sense as we find the future.
I love that. Yes. I got into this work because so much of the conversation that was about Christianity in this country was being dominated by very conservative, white supremacist, white nationalist voices. And I refused to yield the faith of my foremothers and my forefathers and my enslaved ancestors. And so I say that to say that I am always delighted to be a trailblazer, if that is the word, because this is the faith I inherited from those who survived the Middle Passage, and I will not yield it to someone else. And I will also say what gives me hope is over in that corner are students that are dear to me, and I look at them and the work that they do, And I know my labor is not in vain. I know my ancestors' labor was not in vain. And every time I am in a classroom, every time I'm in an educational building, the hope of the 4 folks who will replace us on this panel, even next year, is so exciting to me.
I'm so sorry to say that we're at the end of our time, but I think that's a great note to leave it on. Let's thank again Yolanda Pierce, Casey Slack, Dia Tahir Bakr, and Beth Lockard. I appreciate all of you being here in the audience today, as well as those who are watching online. I want to let you know that the day is not over. We have festival activities continuing until 5:30 p.m. We have food and drink for sale right behind you, and we'll have a great concert this evening with artists from the Ozarks, followed by a community square dance. I'm thrilled to see all of you here and wish you the best of the rest of this festival day. Thank you again.